So let's play Roll the Waves 2 as France, starting in 1920. This is episode number 41. It's the beginning of 1939, and for me, it's that most exciting of times, an opportunity to completely refresh everything about how we're taking forward our navy after a lovely successful war. Let's have a little bit of a review at the state of the fleet and what we want to do with it going forward. First of all, what worked well in this war? So, mainly, the whole navy. The 28-knot battle force, both offensively and as a blockading fleet, really just crushed the Italians. I couldn't really have asked for more. The carrier force is really becoming a force in its own right and achieved some great successes in terms of both protecting the fleet and attacking the enemy fleet. The use of a cap CVL with the slower parts of the battle fleet worked really well. I may need to retire the light carrier that I was using for this because its speed is falling now behind the 28-knot fleet and is only suitable for the 20-knot fleet. But the role of a light carrier just committed to carrying cap worked quite well. The 20-knot fleet itself, mainly consigned to Northern Europe to prevent blockade, worked excellently. It stopped the Italians being able to stick a couple of cheeky battlecruisers into Northern Europe and put us under blockade. Unsung hero minesweeping worked very well. I didn't lose any ships in this war to minesweeping, and I didn't lose any ships to being torpedoed by submarines. So that all worked really well. What worked less well? Still well, but our own submarines didn't really have very much to do with the enemy blockaded. I did have them on fleet support most of the time when I remembered, but again, the Italians didn't come out too much. Land-based air didn't score, so far as I'm aware, any notable successes. However, I did mainly direct it towards suppressing enemy air bases, which was totally the right thing to do, given the pressure that they could put under our fleet under. Cruisers as raiders and as trade protection equally didn't really have very much to do. In a different context, this probably would be different, but in this war, that's how it panned out. And then finally, the losses were trivial. One rather unfortunate heavy cruiser took a torpedo and, despite its torpedo protection, sank. A couple of destroyers lost in aggressive action in battle, and two random coastal submarines sunk. That's an excellent tally, considering the world of hurt that I put onto the Italian Navy. I was asked by Sampras about what was the effectiveness of air defence, so I've had a little look. First of all, of course, losses from air combat are a great deal less than operational losses, and the Italians seem to sustain considerably higher operational losses than we did. However, it's the air defence losses that are the crucial ones because they're the ones who are trying to attack your fleet. So we shot down 75 aircraft, but 60% was shot down by aeroplanes, 40% was shot down by the anti-aircraft defence. Fighters obviously taking the lion's share, but other aeroplanes took a few planes down with them as well. The performance of the anti-air is interesting because it's potentially a guide to how we should structure our air defences on ships. So the heavy anti-air took 20% out, the medium 11 and the light 8. So that's a ratio of 50, 30 and 20. If I have a look at my most recent battleship, the Liberté, it has currently 30, 40 and 20 of these three categories. And if I was to optimize it to reflect this ratio, it would have this kind of force structure. So that's something to bear in mind when I'm refitting ships. As a side note, airships, which, 1938, fairly questionable, but all of their losses were operational, and none of those operational losses were prohibitive. In fact, I've got spots for 56 airships on the airship bases, and I have actually 80, so I've got 24 tucked away in reserve. So I could actually, once it's clear who my next enemy is, actually increase the airship bases in that area. They certainly seem to contribute to the reconnaissance. Indeed, I even saw a parasite fighter launched from an airship do some spotting. So that was all good. Next up, what was the year like? Well, obviously we had those ships sunk. We finished off rebuilding one battleship. We also finished a battleship that was under construction. And we finished 15 submarines, another 15 are underway, and we finished 10 corvettes, as well as 4 more corvettes in our refit program of the oldest. A fair number of technologies. Tension, of course, went up to war with Italy and then down to peace. And the budget therefore seesawed from 483 down to its current 422 and reached a peak of 610. I'm expecting this 422 to increase over 1939. And diplomacy started the year with the Italians getting Borschi, didn't work out well for them, and it's ended the year still with our strong German alliance. I'm not sure why we're at tension 2 with them particularly, but I'm not concerned with that. Tension with Britain is low. America always seems to be a bit belligerent. I'm hoping that Japan will become a future enemy and possibly eventually Britain. But who knows how the gods of tensions will take things. So what should we do for 39? Well, obviously, we need to flatten our costs. If we pop over to here, I've already gone through and put our forces into a few inactive. So basically, anyone with elite is staying active. So that's 3 of the battleships, 3 of the big carriers, a couple of cruisers, and a light carrier. Then everything else is, and 1 or 2 destroyers. Everything else is either in reserve or in mothballs. That's done for our monthly balance. And we've actually got an extremely healthy monthly balance of 4,600, although we've got really nothing under construction other than a couple of designs I've been working on, but I'll get back to them in a minute. If I have a look at the overall plan, in my previous plan, in 34 I think it was, I was planning to rebuild these slow 20-knot ships and take them up to the kind of Marengo Ocean class speed of 23, 24 knots. And that's still an option for Courbet and Magenta, and also for Bouvet and Patry. They could go up to 24, maybe 25 knots. That is their absolute maximum speed. The hull form won't take any more. And I thought, well, actually, is it worth it? Let's pop across and just have a look at the costs. So we'll have a look at the Patry and the Bouvet, because they are the more modern. The Courbets and Magentas already have had a major upgrade. So let's look at the Bouvet and go to Open Rebuild, replace the machinery, take the speed. Now the Bouvet have a speed of 20 knots. Their actual speed should have been 24 knots, but for some tragic failing your speed test reason, that went down 4 knots. I mean, it's really a lot. As I said, if we take it to 26 knots, it tells us that the hull form won't take that. So at 25 knots, it's maximum. There's other little improvements we can do, particularly if we go to, say, Britain for the rebuild. We can get quality 1 guns. We can get better 6-inch guns. The director is fine. That's fine. We can rebalance that slightly. Let me just check. So that's all right. So I'm not going to bother with the anti-air. I could increase the number of 4-inch guns, make them dual purpose. And we come out at a cost of 37,000. Now, that is pretty reasonable. It's less than a quarter of the cost of a brand new battleship. and I'm almost talking myself back into it. But operating a mixed force of 25 knots and 28 knot battleships does seem, I don't know, suboptimal. For me, realistically, a slow battle fleet isn't really going to cut it anymore. It's 28 knots or nothing. Now, you could say, well, we've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 modernized 28 knot battleships. I could have 6 25 knot battleships, plus whatever new battleships I decide to build, more on which later. And, that's not too bad. Surely 25 knots can be useful. Well, if we go back and have a look, I guess the test is, what's the almanac saying in terms of who we'd like to fight? So let's have a little look at Britain and our intelligence on Britain, which is not necessarily great. Now, they do have a lot of ships with a speed of 20 and 23 knots. Actually, only battle cruisers and possibly these new Lion classes with a decent speed. Okay. If we go to Japan, well, yeah, this is talking myself into it. They seem to have a lot of slow battleships and a right old mixture. I don't believe a speed of 18 knots for a minute there. And then battle cruisers of various speeds. It is tricky. Or put another way, it is an exciting choice. Take 2 of these old slow battleships and spend a lot of money and get them up to 28 knots and keep the rest at 20 and then just gracefully retire them. Or bring all 6 up to 25 knots. So hang on, let me just do the maths on that. Okay, I've done a lot of counting on fingers and toes, and I've got a lovely complicated table full of numbers and lots of alternative designs that I've screen captured just to remind myself how to get back to them if I decide to build them or not. Let's go back to my thinking. So there are 5 choices. Number 1, just scrap them. They're not good enough. They don't cut it. Scrap them. That seems too harsh. There is utility, as we saw in the previous war, in having some old slow battleships that stop you from being blockaded, at the very least. So they could have a minimal refit. What do we mean by minimal refit? Well, improve the AA guns up to a decent level, 40, 50, 60. Improve the gun quality up to quality 1. And if they're behind in fire control, lift that up too. So this costs relatively small amounts of money, 9,000, 11,000, 6,000. If I just gave the whole lot a minimal refit, it would cost 52,000. That's 1/3 the cost of a new battleship. So I've got a design study out. I'm calling it the Tourville. That costs nearly 150,000 for a good old-fashioned 9 16-inch 28 knot well protected battleship. So for 1/3 of one of those, you would get 2 second-rate battleships. I'm calling the Marengo and the Ocean second-rate because they're 23 knots. They are torpedo protection 3, and they've got good 9 6-inch guns. And 4 third-rate battleships. Think the R-class in service with the British in World War II that they largely sent out doing convoy protection duties and shore bombardment duties and things like that. That's one very viable and cheap option. You get better shooting and better air defense. The next is to address the protection problem, particularly of these 4. So the Marengo and the Ocean don't need this. They could just have a minimal refit and that would be fine because they've got torpedo protection 3. But the other 4 only have torpedo protection 1. And as we saw with the loss of my heavy cruiser, that's not necessarily good enough. Now that was unlucky, but still. So if I was to do the minimal refit on all of these and bulge them and improve the deck armor, add some deck armor, which does require modernizing the machinery because bulging slows you down. So in order to keep the speed, I would want to increase the engine speeds. That's an error there. That should say 20 knots. I have played with a design that could take you up to 22 knots, and it costs 32,000. But I wanted to keep costs down just for comparison. So here you'd get a couple of 20 knotters. You'd get a couple of 22 knotters. That's because the Bouvet and the Patry only can go at 20 knots, but their design speed was 24 knots. So if you improve the machinery, it zooms up to 24 knots, and then the bulging brings that down to 22. And the Marengo and the Ocean, as I say, would just get a minimal refit, and they would be at 23 knots. This would all cost slightly less than the cost of a new battleship. Again, you'd get 2 second-rate and 4 third-rate battleships, but these 4 third-rate battleships would be much improved. They would be third-rate Star or something like that. And that seems perfectly viable. And if I spent an extra 16,000 and increased these to 22 knots, I would have 4 22s and a 23, not that much different, arguably bringing them up to second-rate standard. However, with a pinch of salt. I can equally do a speed refit. Now, speed refit is, again, doing the minimal in terms of gun quality, anti-aircraft and fire control, and then cranking up the speed as hard as possible. Now, these 4 can only go at 25 knots because of limitations to the hull form. The Marengo and the Océan obviously can very comfortably make 25 knots, and that's one option I explore. But here, the cost is down here for the 25 knots. But if I really dialed it up, I could get it to 28 knots at a cost. And the cost is I would have to bring the main armament down from 16-inch guns to 15-inch guns. Ouch. I mean, 15-inch guns, they're very, very viable weapon. You know, a lot of damage, a lot of hurt in a 15-inch guns. Obviously, 16-inch guns are better. And, you know, emotionally, it seems difficult. I mean, ideally, I would have loved to have just been able to reduce one of the turrets from 3 guns to 2 guns, and that would have been enough. But you can't make that change because it's actually the gun turret that's a complicated bit. And you can't just swap out a 3-gun turret for a 2-gun turret without a lot of hurt. So it costs 93,000, which is a lot. Whereas keeping it to 25 knots only costs 27,000, and you get to keep the 16-inch guns. So 2 speed refit options. So first of all, keeping all of them at 25 knots costs 208,000, or 1.5 new battleships, for which you get 6 good, unquestionably second-rate battleships. And that's, you know I said that anything less than 28 wasn't viable anymore, but, 25? I don't know. When there are so many slow battleships in the world. And then finally, if I go for the full 25 knots for these 4 and 28 knots for these 2, it costs 340,000, so 2.25 new battleships, for which I get 2 first-rate battleships. So that would lift the Marengo and the Océan, even with its reduced guns, to first-rate status, unquestionably. Torpedo protection 3, nearly as good as a new Tourville, but you're getting a Tourville minus for 93,000 instead of 148,000. That's pretty economic. So it's a really tough choice because they are all great choices. I am minded to reject the protection refit. It is attractive. It does make them more survivable. But I don't like the slowness of speed. 22 knots. It's just not quite enough. It's not enough of a speed advantage against what the almanac is telling me. And the almanac may be telling me fibs. When it says 20 knots, it may be 21 knots or 22. So to have a real tactical advantage, I am going to go for the speed refit. And And the speed refit that is the winner is... Let's have a think. And the winner is 25 knots. If I do 25 knots, I've got a coherent force of 6 battleships that can outclass a lot of the rest of the world's navies, and I save money to allow me to build another 1.5 new battleships, first-rate battleships, to take me off into the 1940s and 50s. A 25-knot force also is going to be quicker to rebuild, so 12 months, 21 months for the others, and yeah, that seems to be the best juggling between all of these complex and rich options. Please, please, please tell me what you think. It's a shame I don't quite have enough subscribers. The subscribers don't really matter to me particularly, but when you get more subscribers, you can do some things. And if I have 500 subscribers, I could have had a poll and would have loved to have set out a poll for what you think. But anyhow, let me know in the comments. That's what I'm going to go for in this case. Right. Let's just quickly review what else has happened. I've put a lot of the fleet, as I've mentioned, into mothballs and reserve. I'm building up a nice balance. Under construction, I have 2 designs. So let's just open up these so you can have a quick look. Open, and Tourville is the battleship. Here we are. This weird thing, but when you open up, you get a minus weight and then you fiddle it around and that disappears. So this is kind of what I'm looking at. 8 6-inch, 16-inch guns, 6-inch, 16-inch guns, 28 knots, torpedo protection 3, a big outfit in air defense. It could be bigger, it could be faster, it could have more guns, it could cost a lot more. This feels like a reasonable economic Goldilocks ship. Yeah, individually it might come a cropper against a monster ship, but I don't think the other navy is going to build monster ships. So for now, this seems good enough. And if we have a look at the new carriers that we are naming after. So here we have the Chateau de Foix. It was someone's suggestion, I'm sorry I've forgotten who, but if it was you, here you are, to name a class of ships after French castles. He suggested cruisers, but actually I fancy it in aircraft carriers because I think it's a nice thing. The main thing is they're a bit bigger at 34,000, they're still 29 knots, and all importantly, they have 100 aircraft capacity and torpedo defense 4, which probably should be the new standard. So I've got those 2 as design studies. I may tinker with them as we go. I've fiddled with all the air groups, and basically if the group had fair or good quality, they've been put into reserve. And if it's veteran or expert, I've kept them active in order to protect that quality. And yeah, I was getting confused. Airplanes get to be expert, ships get to be elite. Who knows why? And so, yeah, I feel in a good, solid place with a plan that's taken a while to evolve. You know, many of these, but I feel I'm going to have a fast fleet, a slightly less fast, but still good second-rate fleet. And yeah, we'll start next turn with January properly and see what events take place. Thanks for being patient and bearing with me as I calculate all of this stuff. And stay safe. See you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.